Debe haber alguien.
Pero ¿cómo te va? ¿Te va bien?
¿Me va bien? Sí, sí,
¿Estás solo?
estoy solo por mi cuenta,
¿Y estás agarrando
haciendo...
clientes?
Sí, estoy buscando más, obviamente,
Ya.
pero tengo 2 o 3 proyectos, gracias a Dios.
Que está por la biblioteca.
¿Está por la biblioteca? Pues este edificio es al lado de la biblioteca.
Oigo, pero parece que sabe para dónde viene.
Ok, se graduó de aquí. Ángel, Laura, Ángel.
Soy Ángel Sánchez.
Laura Cantero encantada.
Hey, ¿cómo estás? Señor Dabón, bueno verlo a usted. Ajá,
Fondos federales.
dame un segundito para... ¿Va a besar? Ok. Fondos federales. Sí,
Presupuestos.
sí,
Dice que todo está en crisis.
sí,
Pero, por ejemplo, para una empresa como Dell,
sí.
que quiere renunciar no solamente hardware, sino soluciones, es factible, es viable.
Bueno, depende de quién cuál es tu target market. Obviamente, pues, la empresa privada, yo sé que todo el mundo...
Pero gobierno no.
Ahora mismo, en
No,
este preciso momento, está fuerte la cosa. Sí.
No. Y si es que tal vez hay una licitación o algo, mi preocupación es, sí, yo la gano. Después, ¿cómo me pago? ¿Cómo la cobro? Esa es la realidad.
Es una preocupación legítima. Es una preocupación legítima. No te voy a...
Porque obviamente él vende, y vende bien a nivel privado. Incluso universidades, Ana Geméndez, todo es verde, etc. Pero siempre nuestra preocupación es cómo podemos ayudar al sistema público, cómo podemos ayudar a la Secretaría de Educación, a salud, etcétera, etcétera. Pero, no, es que el dinero.
Permiso. Everything so far, yeah. Thank you.
Entonces siempre el interrogante es, ¿quién sabe dónde hay presupuesto?
Jack 1-2.
Eso es una buena...
Jack 1-2.
Pues, usualmente se supone que OGP, que es la Oficina de Gerencia de Presupuestos,
Pero no es tan fácil llegar a ese nivel.
y el gobierno no es que no te va a pagar, pero se va a tardar
Se va a tardar.
y te van a retrasar.
En otras palabras, no es el momento de estar pitching ahí insistentemente.
Mi sugerencia es ver el año fiscal siguiente empieza en julio, así que el nuevo presupuesto lo van a resolver ahora para junio. Así que ya para julio debe haber un panorama mucho más cierto hacia dónde se dirige la cosa.
Bueno, seguiremos charlando porque de pronto podemos hacer algo por ahí.
Definitivo, definitivo. Pues ya debemos de irnos sentando, pero no sé dónde está Denise.
Es que yo no veía acá de figura hace como 15 años.
Ah, ustedes son panas, sí.
Pues my problem.
¿De verdad? ¡Wow! Ajá, ¿quién? Yo conozco a Daniel.
Pero,
Ah, ¿de verdad? Él y yo nos escribimos así. Sí. It's been done, yo en mi escuela se hizo, pero sí.
y entonces sí, no, yo tengo un para.
Y ahora los dos casados y el con hijos. No tienes hijos, ¿verdad?
Ese era el plan de volverse a
Pues llamó a Denise, ¿verdad? Porque yo no hablé.
ahí, mira, ahí está la sobrina.
Déjame preguntar.
Okay.
How are you?
Bien, ¿tú? ¿Qué hiciste hoy?
Work.
Work. Aprovechaste.
Tuve una reunión por la mañana y después me encerré. O sea, como que literalmente
¿Hasta cuándo va a estar?
hasta mañana a las 6 de la mañana. Que no había forma de hacerlo de otra manera.
Sí, sí.
Hello. Te tengo que dar completo porque uno es de parte de tu mamá. There you go. Completo para que se lo digan. Mira, Miguel.
Sí, llegué anoche, estaba en la guagua aérea porque estaba...
Okay, let's get started.
Estaba con...
¿Estás bien ahí?
Sí. ¿Y tú?
Wow, that was fast. You're nice and quiet. Much appreciated. I'm Bob Tomasco. I'm the director of the Social Enterprise Master's Program at American University. And Federico asked me to welcome you. So, welcome. Was that what the point? Okay, now, I also have got a few things that just want to say in terms of some thanks to Federico for organizing and putting this event on. This is an incredible group we have here. When we planned this, you would not believe, and I kept this from you, how many people came to me and said, Puerto Rico, nobody's interested, nobody will come. No, nonsense. I want photos of this room. I see people standing in the back. So that really showed something. I'm also very sort of personally connected with the island, but I don't know how to make it. When I was in your position, I just graduated from grad school. And my first job was with a consulting firm, a large firm that had done work since the 1950s in Puerto Rico with Bootstrap, a company called Arthur D. Little. And the first project I had, the one that I was either going to prove myself or get fired, had to do with work that we did for the pharmaceutical industry. This is ancient history, but do the numbers 936 mean anything to anyone here? Okay. And the issue then was 1979, was how to preserve that and keep the industry on the island and growing. And our firm was hired to be an objective third-party impact assessor, not just of how many jobs were created, but what was the broad socioeconomic impact of the industry. And I didn't know a thing about it then, but nobody else did. So the project worked, and I think that we held off the Treasury Department and Congress for a decade or two that way. And it got me to fall in love with Puerto Rico, I've got to say, ever since. I didn't know it then because the word wasn't invented, but in a sense, what we were studying in those pharmaceutical companies was social enterprise, because we were trying to make the point that businesses were doing more in Puerto Rico than just coming there to make money and take the profits away, that there's a whole range of benefits that a business can have. And somehow or other, that has led me to the job I have now as a professor here and the head of our social enterprise program. For us, social enterprise is a blend of the business world, the techniques, the performance orientation of it, but also the public sector, the government work, the concern for public issues. And thrown into that mix is some of the passion of NGOs and activists. So you take all those things and you stir them around quite a bit, and you get a Federico. Well done. Social enterprise involves, in its nature, a lot of rethinking of these boundaries of the private sector and the public sector, and rethinking what the role of community groups ought to be, and blending and lowering the walls with these things. That's where things like crowdfunding have come from, design thinking, social impact bonds, impact investment, venture philanthropy. And I think we're going to hear about some of these things from this incredible panel that we put together here. But I think a key aspect of this is we don't believe in social enterprise that it's got to be this or that, that you can often connect things that might seem opposites with an and we want to try to look hard at that. And I think that's some of what this panel is going to be doing here, is we try to look for some creative solutions and what the role of social enterprise might be. One of those biggest dichotomies is, do you develop social and economic prosperity from only the top down? Some say that, or the trickle down. Others say no, it only works from the masses, from the bottom up, from the communities. I can't speak for the whole field of social enterprise, but I'd say that if you apply the lens that we try to take to problems, you need both, and you need both working together well. And I think we're going to hear a lot of ideas about that. So,
Great. Thank you, Bob.
welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. Thank you to our panelists, which I will introduce in a second, and thank you all for coming. Great to see new and familiar faces alike. Bob gave a great intro of what social enterprise is, so I'm glad that I'm off the hook on that, although we will be delving into the topic in more detail shortly. So basically, why are we here? Puerto Rico's been in the headlines for a lot of reasons, mainly due to its financial crisis, but not that many headlines have been generated, especially in the U.S., in terms of what's going on the ground, like Bob said, where the economy is thriving in certain sectors, the communities are getting together, and people are just taking the reins on themselves and trying to move the island forward. So I'll just go through a brief couple of points here. This is our lovely panel here. Hold on 1 second, sorry for the false start. Hold on, it's going backwards. Well, you already saw what I'm going to talk about, so there's no need to do anything else. So, like I said, Puerto Rico's been going through a lot of rough times recently. This wasn't created overnight, and things, in certain respects, aren't that pretty. Unemployment, obviously, when you compare it to the States, where it's 5.5%, is very high. It does show some signs of improvement. Like you can see there, labor force participation has been a major problem in Puerto Rico historically. It used to be about 60% back in the 1960s. It's gone down significantly. Part of what we're going to talk about is how the social innovation movement in Puerto Rico can change the culture and the economy eventually. Why? Because Puerto Rico, for the last few decades, even though the benefits of 936, I can attest to, and a lot of people here can, did create this mentality that people were educated to become employees and not necessarily entrepreneurs. Government dependency is a lot of what has to do with that. And again, I don't really want to super get into the politics of it all, but the numbers speak for themselves. The deficit is what it is. And again, there have been signs of improvement, but things are tough. So part of what we're going to talk about today is what people can do beyond the gloomy numbers and try to say some of the positive things that are going on. These are some of the bad headlines. A lot of this started last summer with a Barron's article that was really bad. But this is the other good news. This is an ecosystem via Grupo Guayacán that shows a lot of what the social enterprise movement in Puerto Rico is doing, a lot of private-public partnerships like Bob mentioned, and a lot of organizations collaborating together. One of the great things, historically in Puerto Rico, there's been a lot of tribalism in the public sector, in the party sector, in the political sector, but also in the private sector, a lot of competition. And that's great, but sometimes if people don't collaborate together and join up, things don't really happen. So this is a good snapshot of what's going on, and the panelists will get into it. So I spoke a little bit about the entrepreneurial culture and why this movement is so key to changing the underpinnings of the socioeconomic problems of Puerto Rico. The spirit of collaboration, a lot of these organizations either work in the same building or collaborate on the same projects, and with many others. And that is something that you didn't see in Puerto Rico before. A co-working space was unheard of maybe like even a year ago. And so, again, this movement, in part, is joining two seemingly, to use Bob's word, two dichotomies. You think that you can't rely on the government for everything, so you should do your thing on your own. But I think social innovation, especially in Puerto Rico, is about empowerment, but also bringing together minds to collaborate together on the social good, which sometimes is missing from the private equation. And one of these initiatives, which garnered a lot of headlines in Puerto Rico, was Campus Puerto Rico, which is something that, again, was never heard of before. All the major universities signed the Memorandum of Understanding to market Puerto Rico as one educational destiny. And in the Summit of the Americas that was held recently, that was historic. Everybody heard about what happened with Cuba, and Puerto Rico was a part of that story as well. Some of the organizations here present have a lot to do with what happened, especially Mr. Steve Vedder and the Foundation for Puerto Rico. So just want to take a look at how Puerto Rico was featured in Panama a couple of weeks ago.
And I am especially pleased that we are joined this evening by the Secretary of State of Puerto Rico. The Secretary is here with a number of Puerto Rican rectors whose universities are ready to welcome Latin American and Caribbean students to an American educational experience on the Isla del Encanto.
Yeah, he was proud of that. And for John Kerry to show emotion is not a small feat. I can say that because I used to work with him. Anyway, so I'm going to give a brief intro of our panelists, and I really want to get into the discussion and for all of you to participate as well. Our first panelist, Laura Cantero, is the Executive Director of Grupo Guayacán, Inc. Laura was a former manager at the Latin American Financial Services practice at Ernst & Young in Panama. Actually, great segue. She has over 10 years of experience in the financial services industry. She has a bachelor's degree in economics from the Wharton School at UPenn and an MBA from the IE Business School in Madrid. And I'll let her speak about Grupo Guayacán and all the great things that they do. But basically, they're a private sector-driven nonprofit organization. They started out as a fund of funds in the private equity world, and now they're promoting entrepreneurship in Puerto Rico. So we're glad to have her here. Miguel Columna, he's co-founder and managing director of Comprometidos, and he's a proud AU alum. He has Hill experience. He was previously a special assistant to the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, so he has a lot of federal and nonprofit and political experience. And he's also a World Economic Global Shaper and a member of the WEF's Global Agenda Council on Migration. Denise, who will I introduce in a second, is also a global shaper, so we're really glad to have them. And what is Comprometidos? It's a millennials-led think, do tank, developing innovative public-private partnerships that advance the economic development of Puerto Rico. Sounds great. We'll see what they have to say for themselves. Denise, I'm very happy to have everybody here, but Denise, I'm particularly happy to have, not just because she was my intern when I used to work on Capitol Hill, but because part of the negative headlines you see about Puerto Rico is the outward migration from the island. We've lost 300,000 people in an island of 3.5 million. That's a lot of people. With all of the socioeconomic impact that has. But Denise is a different story. She left Puerto Rico after she graduated, and she went to work for Goldman Sachs in New York City. And then she decided she wanted to do something for her country and went back to Puerto Rico, worked for the Government Development Bank in a very high-level position, and now is in the Foundation for Puerto Rico. Let me see what her title is again. Okay, a program manager, but she does a lot more than that. And so what is the Foundation for Puerto Rico? Not that old, only a couple of years old. It's a nonprofit organization that works with a defined plan to develop Puerto Rico's social and economic potential and transform it into an important competitor in the world. And they're also a key member of the group that's trying to move forward with Campus Puerto Rico. And finally, Steve Vedder. And a lot of people may wonder why Steve Vedder here. Well, Steve Vedder is key. He has a lot of experience in the social innovation and development field in Latin America, of which Puerto Rico is a key part of. He was also integral in having Secretary Kerry mention those words and signing an agreement with Campus Puerto Rico to move that forward, to get Latin American students and students from the U.S. to study in Puerto Rico. For those of you who don't know, the tuition is cheap. We speak Spanish and English, and they're all accredited by the U.S. Credit agencies. So Steve has 35 years of experience in the field that I just mentioned. He has an MA in economics from Ohio University, a BA in economics from the same place as well. And he is the president and CEO of Partners of the Americas. Partners of the Americas is key in promoting the State Department's goals in Latin America. And I'll let you get into more details. So without further ado, let's start with Laura and hopefully our discussion soon thereafter. Thanks again.
All right. right, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel of friends and colleagues. First of all, thanks to Fele and to Bob and to the school for allowing this to happen. I think it was funny to hear Bob say that there might have been not much interest, but really the turnout has surprised me. So thank you for being here. Lots of familiar faces, but also lots of new ones. As Federico mentioned, I am the executive director for Grupo Guayacán. How many of you in the audience know what Guayacán is? All right, about 15%. That's pretty good. Okay, I know many of you might be worried about the troubling news that you hear from Puerto Rico, like some of the headlines that Fede showed us. And sometimes because we're all overwhelmed by this news, we fail to see or to recognize the things that are going on below the radar. So I hope that the panel today gives you all an opportunity to learn about some of those things. That's what we're here to talk about, mission-driven organizations that are working hard to beat the odds and generate impact in order to move Puerto Rico forward. Movements that have true transformative potential for Puerto Rico. Being a banker by training, 2 years ago, I had no idea what social innovation was. And I didn't know that I would end up working for a social enterprise. But what was perhaps more surprising is the impact that a social enterprise can have on Puerto Rico's transformation. As Fede said, I was living in Panama up until 2 years ago when I decided to return. And my main driver was just the feeling that I had to do something about it if I ever wanted to go back. After working briefly at Foundation for Puerto Rico with Denise and her team, I was offered the job to lead Guayacán. As Fede mentioned, Guayacán is a private organization. We are a nonprofit, and we were founded in 1996, so almost 20 years ago, with a unique model that couples private equity investment with a series of programs aimed at developing, strengthening, and advancing Puerto Rico's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Why is that? Because as was also mentioned before, we were really educated and bred to be employees of big corporations. So now the economic situation is taking us in a different direction, and we need to be able to give the people the tools that they need to do that. So we are a social enterprise, although I bet our founders did not even know the term 20 years ago when it was founded. And it was funny that Bob mentioned Arthur D. Little in his opening remarks, because Guayacán stemmed from an Arthur D. Little study, actually. And what few people know about that seems particularly relevant right now is that Guayacán was actually a spin-off of the Government Development Bank. So, you know, the big bank that has the liquidity problems that's in the news all the time. So there was the young guy back in the 90s who was working at GDB. And as you know, the economic situation in Puerto Rico in the 90s was quite different than it is today. So a lot of money was flowing in, mostly because of 936, and big infrastructure projects were going on. And our founder, Enrique Azuar, was bold enough to say that that wasn't sustainable economic development. So he commissioned the Arthur D. Little study, and the findings of the study were pretty simple, really, that there was no private equity market in Puerto Rico, so it was impossible to generate investments in local companies. But Enrique's argument was, we have to start investing in these local companies in order to allow them to grow and therefore compete globally, because if not, we are not creating sustainable economic development. That's pretty innovative for 1995 in Puerto Rico, don't you think? So Guayacán's quest to create this private equity market began by providing local institutional investors access to the private equity asset class. Many investors at the time did not even know what private equity was. We have a lot of bankers, myself included, and we're all very good in the public markets, but the private markets, it wasn't as sexy. It was a different level of risk, and we didn't really know too much about that. So since 1996, through a strategic partnership with Abbott Capital in New York, we provide institutional investors access to top quartile U.S. and international private equity funds. Right now, we have about $150 million in assets under management in 3 different vehicles. And I can't really talk much about the funds because we're in the midst of our fundraising cycle, but I'd be happy to talk to any one of you at the reception afterwards if you're interested. Now, some of you might ask yourself, so how does this whole private equity instrument lead to entrepreneurial development? And the reason is really fairly simple. The revenues that we generate from our fund of funds are the ones that allow us to do our programs and really help the entrepreneurial community. So that is why we are a nonprofit. Grupo Guayacán is a nonprofit in Puerto Rico, and we also have a separate entity called Enterprise Events, which is a 501c3 with which we run our programs. So basically, the map that Federico showed you up there, that's a really recent map of all the grassroots movements that have stemmed to support entrepreneurial development in Puerto Rico at different stages of growth of the entrepreneur. And I would bet that that map didn't look like that 2 years ago. A lot of the organizations that are on there are very new. And although it seems like it's very, very full and it's almost overwhelming, we are still dealing with some fragmentation within the ecosystem. And part of the reason that we like doing panels like these is this, although we collaborate with each other, it's good to see that we can work together on efforts to increase our impact. So I'm not going to go into detail in all our programs, but basically we have a program for startups, a program for more mature companies. We recently launched a program in collaboration with Georgia Tech to commercialize research out of the universities, an issue that is very related to the Campus Puerto Rico initiative, with Denise will talk about. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was really the change that we see in the access to capital arena in Puerto Rico. So we hear about the liquidity problems all the time, but even with the erosion of local capital due to our current economic situation, Puerto Rico still holds a significant amount of capital through our local institution. This is a capital base that has been amassed throughout past decades and resides in many organizations, retirement systems, banks, insurance companies, financial institutions, university endowments. Some estimates place this number at $30 billion. Because the economy has been hard hit, and so have these investments. These investors are now looking for new innovative investment alternatives which seek return. But they put a big emphasis on being able to create local impact. So for example, the reason that I arrived late last night is because this weekend, Sam Boyd from the Small Business Administration, the Office of Innovation and Investment, was in Puerto Rico all weekend to talk about different vehicles that we can leverage to allow access to capital for the companies that need it, regardless of their stage of development. So I'm not going to take up more time, but as you can see, lots of things are going on in Puerto Rico. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Denise. Before I turn it over to Miguel, I forgot to mention one point. We have a hashtag, innovating PR, so if you want to take pictures, make comments, please use the hashtag. And we did tweet out the program and the bios, so we went green, and so you can use the handle at FDJ Solutions DC for that. And I wanted to thank Alessandra Clara, who also helped to put this together. But without further ado, please, Miguel, take it away.
Thank you, Fede, and thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. I'll be a little shorter than Laura because we haven't been around since 1996. We certainly don't have $150 million in assets. But I will tell you that the Comprometidos, the way I see it, really started on this campus. I came to DC to study at American University. And when I was younger, I really thought that government was the optimal change-making mechanism. And fast forward a couple of years after working at the Hill and other offices, I learned that that was not the case, and that civil society and private sector were critical partners in development, and were also sometimes more efficient and more effective at generating that change. So that's when I learned about the role of think tanks and development and consulting firms, venture philanthropy, nonprofit organizations, and social enterprises, and that were often at the forefront of social and economic development. And I started to compare that with the counterpart, the ecosystem in Puerto Rico, which was not that picture. And we found that the civil society in Puerto Rico is, this is a personal opinion, but it's absolutely dependent on government for development. And we rely on government for social and economic development with certain bright spots, but that were generated, in 1996, not at current times. And that our civil society was focused on mitigating systemic failures like homelessness or after-school dropout rates and after-school delinquency, juvenile delinquency, but that we were not working to fix systems. So we started I decided to go back to Puerto Rico as well, and it was very apparent that there was an opportunity to create an institution that raised the stakes and tried to move the needle on these public-private partnerships as it relates to economic development. And that's when we started Comprometidos about 2 years ago as a millennials-led think and do tank, because we don't have the luxury to think too much. We have to do because we are in crisis. And advancing these public-private partnerships for economic development. Since then, we've been working with the private sector to shape the social impact in some of the Puerto Rico's largest firms. And we're really excited to launch next month the Puerto Rico Global Initiative, which is the first diaspora engagement for economic development strategy the country has had. And I'll be speaking more about it in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Denise.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Buenas tardes. So Foundation for Puerto Rico is a nonprofit we've only been around for 2 years. And I've been working at Foundation for about 1 year and 3 months, which is the same amount of time that I've been in the nonprofit sector, or like I prefer to call it, a purpose-driven organization, or purpose-driven sector, which I love Laura's spin to it with the mission-driven. Love it. And I think the main reason why I switched sectors was because same reason why the same realization that Miguel came about, that we need collaboration between sectors and there's no silver bullet. And so Foundation began, its founder, John Borshow, he had the urge, he's a businessman, he was a businessman, and he had this urge to see what he could do to kind of transform the socioeconomic situation in Puerto Rico. And he commissioned a series of studies with his alma mater, MIT, and he shared it with everyone he knew in the public sector. He had lunch with businessmen in Puerto Rico, and he thought a bit naively that was enough to get things moving and get people fired up about creating solutions for Puerto Rico. So that was not the case. And he saw that he had to do it himself. He had to enrollarse las mangas, as we like to say in Spanish. And so he sold his company.
Which means roll up your sleeve for the non-Spanish.
Roll up your sleeves, yes. So he sold his company and started Foundation for Puerto Rico. And at Foundation for Puerto Rico, our main vision is an island, Puerto Rico, inserted in the global economy. And the way we think that Puerto Rico can do that is many ways, but the main two that we are focused in is attracting visitors to Puerto Rico and developing our visitor economy. And that's how can we make people have an authentic experience in Puerto Rico, much more beyond, right, the beaches and our forts, our Spanish forts, but how can we have them enjoy education in Puerto Rico, right? How can they choose Puerto Rico to be educated or to receive medical attention, etc. And we also support innovation-driven enterprises and 21st century knowledge. And that's why, since the beginning, we've been collaborating very closely with Comprometidos. We kind of started at the same time, right, about 2 years ago. And Grupo Guayacán, we've had a really intimate relationship since the beginning, and since the beginning of Foundation for Puerto Rico, and we collaborate in many different ways. I'm happy to go into specifics of our projects as we go along in the discussion.
Thank you, Denise. And Steve, if you could.
And boy, do we have a great marketing plan for Campus Puerto Rico. You'll see a photograph of 2 palm trees with a hammock in between. It goes, ditch the dorm. Come study in Puerto Rico. I think Secretary of State Kerry sort of captured the magic, really, of the Summit of the Americas. It was a really exciting time. And it turns out that the initiative that President Obama put together, 100,000 Strong in the Americas, really was one of the centerpieces. They talked basically about 3 initiatives. First of all was climate and climate change. Secondly was education. And the third was job security, jobs and income. But it was really education, workforce development, human capital formation that captured the imagination of everyone. The willingness of Puerto Rico to be the first state government to finance one of the competitive rounds on 100,000 Strong literally captured the imagination of everyone. And there was a tremendous amount of competition around that because Colombia was also getting ready to sign a large agreement with us, but Puerto Rico really got there. What was surprising about it as well was the fact that given the financial crisis, the fact that Puerto Rico was willing to lay down the gauntlet and say, look, it's about education. Let's rebuild around this, okay? And I was so glad that they got all the notoriety, all the credit for this highly innovative Campus Puerto Rico. Let me back up a little. When President Obama came in, they said, look, you have no money for Latin America. It's all wrapped up with the Congress. There's nothing you can do. Okay, so be nice and get on with the Middle East and China. And he goes, wait a minute. This is our hemisphere. It's extremely important. And Ben Rhodes in the National Security Council was working with Dan Restrepo, and they were talking about one of the problems that he could solve. And it was this. There are 575,000 students studying in the United States from Asia. Out of all of Latin America, it's a total of 65,000. There are more students from Korea alone studying in the U.S. than all of Latin America, 67,000. There are more students studying from Vietnam than from Mexico, our third largest trading partner. And all of a sudden, people start asking this question, how would you explain this? What's the blockage? Why aren't we more connected? And we were Partners of the Americas was invited to a discussion at the White House, and we had encouraged them to bring together some chancellors from universities and some business leaders together. And all we heard were all the reasons why that couldn't be corrected. That there were these well-worn paths to Europe. That's where U.S. students would go. And Korea was Korea, and China was putting all the money in. It just wasn't going to happen. And at the end, we raised our hand and said, look, you've identified all the problems, but none of the opportunities. There's a way to solve this, and this is the way we would do it at Partners of the Americas. We would set up a competition, an innovation premium or prize, to reward the 2 universities that come together, North and South, to bring their students together. And we're informed by this because we currently have 1,700 graduates out of Paraguay who have studied at the University of Kansas. If you go to Cochabamba, Bolivia, there are 1,400 graduates out of Fayetteville, Arkansas. simply because we connected them in a meaningful way. Faculty and students start going back and forth, and they go, this is valuable to our university. We want to sustain this. And by the way, all the students that come up from Paraguay or Bolivia truly are bilingual. And with all due respect from those coming out of Asia, not all of them always are. And so the universities value this. So the President Obama asked, well, how would you put together this award fund? And we go, pues claro, we would put together a public-private partnership. Tell me what CEO working in Latin America won't say my biggest challenge, it's not materia prima, it's not highways, it's not airports, it's human capital. It's a bilingual, college-educated, computer-literate person. They're fighting for them in every single country, okay? And so we'll go to the corporations and we'll try to get them to underwrite this. Well, the first corporation, Banco Santander, goes, brilliant idea, we're in for $1 million. Exxon came in very quickly with another $1 million. Coca-Cola has come in. And Puerto Rico came in along with around 4 other donors to this Innovation Award Fund. And we run it as a classic RFP. Best ideas based on merit and innovative breakthroughs on how you're going to connect and increase the flow of students. What really caught us about the imagination about Puerto Rico is that we have been following this fact, trend line. The United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, next to Mexico. It's 52 million people. And the tipping point on that being cool to be bilingual, I certainly see evidence of in my own community, where I had people before would say, why are you speaking in a foreign tongue? Speak English. They go, hey, how did you learn Spanish? Why do you speak Spanish? How would I go about learning Spanish? And then how long does it take? Where do I go? And so you start tracking the trend line on this. It used to be Cuernavaca, Mexico. That got unsettled. It moved to Antigua, Guatemala. It settled there for a while. All the universities, all the centers set up. And all of a sudden it jumps. It goes to Buenos Aires. That's a long ways away. It's very expensive. And so we were having this discussion. What happened in this game with DR and Puerto Rico? And then Federico and some of the other representatives of Puerto Rico said, this is campus partners. We go, this is a brilliant idea. How can we help you expand that and really let you become one of the destinations, certainly for becoming bilingual? When we heard that there were over 50 recognized universities with over 104 campuses, we go, people, you've got something here that is intrinsically valuable. I had a dear friend in the Dominican Republic, Ramon, and I used to work with him. Ramon Dabon, our in-house, in-resident intellectual on all these issues. You ought to be sitting up here with me, Ramon. Come on. And
also Puerto Rican.
Yeah. And his name is Freddie Ginebra, and he created, like you all, an NGO called Casa Teatro. And when we're talking about migration, asked him once, I said, so Freddie, what does it look like to you? He said, Steve, look, you can speed it up. You can slow it down. You can change the laws either way. You can't stop it. We're coming together. And what we're trying to do is create the base of understanding so that when we do come together, we come together in really the right way. And I thought he had it right. I still do. Now, Freddie was a great believer in the power of cultural identity. And so he said, we're sick and tired of only getting European and U.S. culture. What about Dominican culture? What would happen if in the Casa Teatro we created a place to record music and have painters paint and writers write? So the Inter-American Foundation, with Ramon's help, we supported Casa Teatro. I almost lost my job over it. We had some conservative board members saying, well, Vetter's throwing money at these artists. So I'm sitting there 25 years later, and they go, first Latin Grammy Awards, 440 from Dominican Republic, Juan Luis Guerra. And I go, oh my God, there it is again. So I called up Freddie and I go, tell me about Juan Luis Guerra. And they go, Steve, he's off the charts. He set up his own foundation. He just built the first hospital for diabetic children. He's built a whole chain of housing for ancianos. And he's just on fire with this thing, okay? Buena Vista Social Club. Have any of you looked at the balance of payments, the net movement of capital around this second release, Lost and Found? Great title. If you haven't heard this one, listen to it. And then if you shift over to Jamaica, we had also worked with a group called the Mystic Revelations of Rastafari. And they just wanted a place to record for local kids to get together. And after a while, there was a young man named Bob Marley that it just took off. And within 5 years of his release, he had more money in his personal account than the central bank and all of tourism and bauxite combined. You couldn't get a loan without his underwriting it. And it was that reminder again of what they're trying to uncover is this innate talent, this human capital, this intellectual wealth that's there. How do you see it? How do you know what it is when you do see it? And then how do you capture it and bring it together? Now, a final comment. We met recently with John Kerry's number 2. And I won't mention his name. He's a wonderful man for attribution because he may have to deny this. But he says, Steve, you got to understand something. It used to be all bilateral. It was only government to government. There was no space for any of this civil society talk. And indeed, Partners of the Americas was created 50 years ago when John Kennedy at the last minute said, look, I'm trying to kiss and make up with Eisenhower. He did this people-to-people thing. Let's put this little tiny NGO there, the first one, and we'll call it Partners of the Americas, and we'll see what happens with it. But it's just a favor. Later, we were kicked out on the street, and we had to fight to survive. And here we are 50 years later, and this is what the ambassador had to say. There is nothing happening bilaterally with any innovation whatsoever. Every government is locked up and locked down politically. It's all happening in this NGO nonprofit field. This is where the energy is. This is where the talent is. And we take our hats off to you for coming together and putting this innovation award together, and also for recognizing what Puerto Rico is doing. The fact that it was your foundation and one of these interesting people who go, I'm just not ready to sit back and let this unwind, right? I'm just not ready not to do something. I'm going to stand up and figure out where to put the needle in the acupuncture chart. Now, if you look at the Ashoka Fellows, Bill Drayton did a great job of putting this together as change makers. The Skoll Foundation and others set up the Social Entrepreneur Network. The first time I ever heard the word was in the Dominican Republic in 1975 from Freddie Ginebra, soy empresario social. And I said, no se mezcla arroz con mango. You're mixing two different things here. But it has grown. But the impulse, the DNA of that is someone who knows you can improve these communities and make a difference. We believe that the moment you volunteer to help someone else, you enter the circle of leadership. And whether you do it as a social entrepreneur, a change maker, or just a good old volunteer, you're in a leadership capacity. My final fun comment, recently one of my sons asked me if I would come to Career Day and talk about what I do. And I said, sure. And he goes, but you can't tell them you work for a nonprofit. I said, well, that's what I do. He says, just don't do it. I go, well, what am I supposed to say? He says, just don't tell them you work for a nonprofit. I go, what's the problem with it? He goes, it's a not. Kids just aren't into the negative. So I walk into this career panel. There's an admiral from the Naval Academy. I live in Annapolis. And there's a captain from Delta Airlines in his uniform, and I'm there in a tie-dye sweater or something. And I'm sweating, and my sons are sitting there looking at me, and I go, I'm Steve Vetter, and I'm the head of a social profit agency. And they go, what's a social profit agency? I said, we try to delete and erase the social costs that are killing us. Here's one example. It costs $8,500 on average to educate someone in a public school. It costs $35,000 to incarcerate them if they're over the age of 18. Who's going to get rid of those social costs? And that's the role of a for social profit agency. You heard it here, Federico.
Thank you, Steve. Very illuminating as always. All right, so we'll have a couple of discussion questions amongst ourselves, and then we obviously want to open it up for audience Q&A. I wanted to start with Laura. I think you hit the nail on the head on the entrepreneurial culture in Puerto Rico. And as the oldest of the organizations, not age-wise, of course.
Also age-wise, except for Steve.
Well, actually, I'm a bit older than you, but I won't.
We are millennials, remember?
Sure. All right. I'm in between Gen X and millennial. Depends on the day that you catch me. So could you go into a little bit further about how you see the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Puerto Rico, and what trends do you see as potential change makers for, just trying to shift the paradigm in the problems that we were trying to identify? And obviously, if anybody else wants to chime in.
Okay, and cut me off because I can go on forever.
All right, I'll just stop you.
Yep, good plan. So we addressed the fact that we were all educated to become, employees of big corporates, and job security being a big part of that. So I think that because of the economic situation, that's one of the things that have changed. I like to say that, in comparison with some places in the States, like Silicon Valley or Boston or places like that, where innovation and entrepreneurship are almost a part of the DNA, in Puerto Rico, really, we are entrepreneurs out of the necessity, not really because we have a conviction that wants to make us entrepreneurs. That's really it's quite confusing, because many would say, no, but Puerto Ricans, they solve everything, they solve problems, they go out there and do what they need to do to survive, and so that makes you think that they have an entrepreneurial spirit, but still everything that is stable and comfortable and secure is what's been ingrained in us. So I think that the first shift is that we're beginning to realize that in order to get out of the hole, we have to do something about it. And it's not, up to others. Miguel and Denise both spoke a little bit about the role of the government. And so we're beginning to realize that it's not up to the government to solve our problems for us. And even entrepreneurs in Puerto Rico, who mostly had led family businesses because they just stumbled upon them, they were used to going to the government for subsidies, and they were used to going to the banks for money, for loans, and that's over. So then what do you do now when the government doesn't have any more subsidies to give you, when the bank won't loan you what you need to survive? You sort of have to pivot, and so I think that the change in paradigm from the entrepreneur perspective, and let me clarify, speaking of age earlier, that in the beginning, most of our programs that were for the startup community, the main target was students or young people, because you would think that they're more exposed to innovation and new ideas and these things. And what we found in our programs is that, for example, the last two winners of our startup competition for the last 2 years have been over 60. And so why is that? Because these people have been forced to rethink who they are, what they do, and they actually come up with very good ideas. And the second change, I would say, which is the one I'm most passionate about, is the access to a capital issue that I mentioned earlier. So in the same way that entrepreneurs have had to change, financial professionals have also had to change. So when I started at Guayacan 2 years ago, we would put together a panel of investors to hear the pitches of our more mature companies after they were done with the program. And you basically had to call people up and beg them, please, please, please come see these pitches. I promise they're good. You have to meet so-and-so. And so you could get a couple of like banker friends together in the room, but there weren't really any investors who were willing to put money into these companies. And I really think that that has been the biggest change, because many of the financial professionals have also had to reinvent themselves. Many people who worked in investment banking saw their models collapse. So now you have all these bankers that are 40 years old and they're like, oh, wait, I'm too young to retire. I've lost a lot of money. What do I do with my life? Oh, so let's go start a private equity fund. What does that mean? I mean, and some of them, because I came from banking, would call me and say, listen, I have to go to your office, but it has to be at 7 o'clock at night because I don't want anybody to see me. Mm-hmm. And I would say, okay, so come at 7, and it would all be very secretive, and they would like tiptoe into my office, and they were like, listen, I'm leaving such and such a bank. I want to raise a fund. And they would say it like with all this mystique, and most of them don't really know what they're saying. But I think that the movement to really learn about it and to get these companies the access to capital they need is having an impact. And on Saturday, we had a demo day for the program, and instead of having to beg people, I had to turn people away. We had a total of 27 investors who were willing to put their money where their mouth is and invest in these companies. So I'm very proud of that.
Thank you. And check out the Enterprise startup competition that you guys do every year. For those of you watching at home, we're also live streaming as well.
I'd like to add something to that. Regarding how the entrepreneurship ecosystem has evolved, I would say that maybe 3 years ago, there was no community per se, and it was very, very, very fragmented, like the stakeholders within the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And I think that from that time to the present, I think the most important thing is that one of the things actually that I loved about DC when I interned here is that every day there is a networking event. Every day you can go to an event based on your interests, and you meet new people, you connect, you inspire each other, and you push each other to be better, right? And when I moved back to Puerto Rico, that was not the case. But now there are consistent activities and events around entrepreneurship. Whether it's, all these programmers and coders getting together every Tuesday evening at Piloto 151, which is the first co-working space. Or whether it's everyone telling each other about their mistakes on Pilotos. The name is Fuck Up Nights. I'm not kidding. And the thing is, in Puerto Rico, there's all these taboo and aversion to risk that is
to failure
and to failure, right? That's exactly what hinders people to just go on and do startups. And so all these taboo, you have to kind of just let it go by talking about it and laughing about it. So that's happening. Then every Wednesdays in the morning, there's 1 Million Cups, which is a movement nationwide that was started by the Kaufman Foundation. And we're hosting it. And it's Pecha Kucha style, where all these entrepreneurs are up there, and then they receive feedback, connect each other. And there's many, many more. Grupo Guayacán is always hosting events, workshops, and it's great because when you want to learn about what's going on in Puerto Rico, there's always something to do every week. So I think that has always also contributed to a community building where you kind of know what everyone's doing, and that's one of the main things that Puerto Rico has to do. We have to know what everyone's doing. We need to collaborate, we need to connect, and we cannot compete with each other and not share our ideas, our best practices. Many times, I'm sure we've all heard when people say, I have this idea, but you can't tell anyone. They're going to take my idea away. And slowly but surely, that's going to start changing. People are going to start sharing their ideas, and they're going to be creating teams that are going to get together to create startups that are going to go through all these programs that Grupo Guayacán is having, and then they're going to get funded.
Thank you, Denise. And speaking of getting more engagement, I wanted to ask Miguel with your project and engaging the diaspora. What has your experience been with that? And a lot of us here, at least from the Puerto Rican community, those of us who stayed here, are always eager to get more involved and to see how we can help Puerto Rico in small ways and large ways. So if you could expand on that a little bit, I would appreciate it.
So like I said at the beginning, we started Comprometidos 2 years ago, and we're 5 co-founders, and all 5 of us were in the diaspora, either in DC, New York, or in El Salvador, where one of our co-founders was working with the first Puerto Rican woman ambassador of the United States, Mari Carmen Aponte. So we were from the diaspora at the beginning, and when we launched, and we went with this call to action that first, as a generation, we have to get involved. The island was, the context when I said I came here, and that's where Comprometido started. The crisis started in 2006. That's when I came into campus. By the time it was 2010, and campus is a bubble. You're worried about other things. By the time we became young professionals, 2 years out of the market, the college, that's when these headlines were starting to pop up. And we had to ask ourselves, what is it that we want out of our island, and how are we going to make that happen? How are we going to make what we want out of it rather than expect others to do it for us? And so we went with this call to action, to New York, to DC, we came here in DC, to Miami and San Juan. And what we learned 2 years ago was that there is a lot of knowledge, a lot of connections, and a lot of interest, but there was no infrastructure to transfer all that interest and knowledge into development in Puerto Rico. There was no bridge to connect what's going outside and what's going on in the island. And so that's when we started a year ago, thinking about how to create a diaspora engagement for economic development strategy. We did not want to reinvent the wheel, so we started benchmarking what other countries were doing. We found around 400 initiatives in 56 different countries. Puerto Rico has one of the most educated and largest and mobile diasporas, and we had nothing. And so we really started working with the public sector, with the department, the stakeholder in this case, the Department of Economic Development and Commerce, in shifting the mindset in terms of policy. There was no diaspora engagement strategy. There was nothing, and we were showing white papers, results, Chile, Global, 76 new companies of diaspora collaborations. Connect Ireland, which uses the diaspora to promote tax incentives, and Ireland has, since the same time we started in 2012, 2,000 jobs because of diaspora promoters. And Global Scott, same thing, $50 million in value added. And we had nothing, and it was because we weren't having nothing because we were expecting somebody to create something. So after the research, we really, I think, recognized that perhaps one of the best competitive advantages that we have to, one, get out of the financial crisis, and 2, compete in the global knowledge-based economy is our diaspora. In the global knowledge-based economy, knowledge is a commodity, and the diaspora, it's a gold mine. We have Puerto Ricans at the highest levels of government, national and multinational, international corporations, and we're not tapping into that gold mine. And so what we kind of learned also in that research is that diasporas connect their countries of origin to these global networks of best practices and technologies that are not in the country of origin. And when they transfer that, and if they are strategically engaged, they are a source of economic opportunities. And so that's why we create Puerto Rico Global, which is it's a platform to facilitate the communication and the links between investors, entrepreneurs, professionals, and students in the island and in the diaspora. It has an offline component where we go travel the country and the world, hopefully, engaging with the diaspora and telling them about all these tax incentives that Puerto Rico has to offer, and asking them to become champions of these incentives in their networks and in their companies. And we have someone here from Bianca Caban, who is an ambassador. We recruited her in New York when she was working for the ex-CEO of Barclays. Puerto Rican second generation had never thought of Puerto Rico as a way of doing business, and she quit the job and started her own investment firm exploring opportunities in Puerto Rico. And that's what we need. If we get 5 Biancas, we can create a lot of impact. So the first objective, like I said, is to attract foreign direct investments through the diaspora. The second one is to attract and retain competitive human capital. Denise, after 8 years, was in Goldman Sachs. She was eager and ready to go back to Puerto Rico, but she didn't know where to canalize and where to go. And when we started our first year of learning what the private sector needed, in Puerto Rico, there are great high-paying jobs at very high, sophisticated levels of companies that are engaging in global markets. But because these Puerto Ricans are outside of Puerto Rico, they don't know where these opportunities are. So really what we're doing is sharing with our networks where are these opportunities are to help Puerto Rican companies grow and create more jobs. The third one is to support the export services of Puerto Rican goods and services. Example, if you're a Puerto Rican in Boston, this is basic examples and testimonials, things that we've done offline. Puerto Rican wants to go to Boston, software technology company, ready to grow and export, but they don't know anybody in Boston. But there are many Puerto Ricans at MIT and in the ecosystem, and we connect them, and through them they share the ecosystem and help them find new clients, etc. So I won't take over the panel, but one aspect is that, and I think it combines the necessity and who's going to do it. As educated professionals, and we're all interested, either because we walked through the door, we have to recognize or start thinking, how can we use our networks and our connections and our grant opportunity emails that we get and we can forward, and how do we connect that to the island? And we would add, because we're in a knowledge-based economy, that's what we need. We don't need, perhaps we need your capital, but we also need your human capital.
Thank you, Miguel. Denise, I want to ask you about Kiva SIP and the project that we spoke about yesterday before, and then Steve, I'm going to ask you about what we can learn from other movements in Latin America and how other Latin American countries are tapping into their diaspora. But before, I want to go to Denise, because the diaspora is thirsty and eager to engage in projects that impact real people. And yesterday I learned about a fellow called Fello, in Utuado, who has this great micro agriculture enterprise. So if you could talk a little bit about that and the Fellos of the world and how we can help them out, I would appreciate it.
I'm excited to do so. So a couple of years ago, I went to the Global Venture, the Guayacan Venture, Global Venture, Puerto Rico Venture Forum. Jesus, yes. Puerto Rico Venture Forum of Guayacan. 2 years ago. I was still at the Government Development Bank, but I was starting to want to get involved in other sectors and see what else I could do. So I turned to Guayacan to see what what was happening. And I met this person that was talking to us about Kiva. I had no idea what it was. And then I saw throughout his speech, right? He gave us the example of this woman in Africa that needed to buy sheep because she made cheese and she had 7 children to feed. She only needed $100. And seeing that picture and seeing how she had successfully fundraised a 0% loan from a crowd of individuals, for me was so empowering. And 2 years later, someone from Argentina had to come to Puerto Rico, and she put me in contact with Johnny Price, who I think is here.
His dad.
Amazing. This is awesome. And I asked him, is there a particular reason why Puerto Rico is not one of those 85 countries that is participating in Kiva or whose entrepreneurs have access to capital through Kiva? And they said, no particular reason. We just need a partner down there. And I'm like, well, can Foundation for Puerto Rico be that partner? And so here we are. We are currently our first entrepreneur from Puerto Rico ever in 10 years is currently fundraising through Kiva, a 0% interest loan that he needs in order to be able to buy certain equipment that he needs to comply with the Department of Health's requirements for that license, you know, the one that takes almost 6 months to get. And so that he can supply sodas that he makes from fresh fruit that he farms in Utuado. And these are natural fermented sodas. They're actually probiotics, so they're good for the health. And all these restaurants are asking and pleading him for these sodas, but he doesn't have the license. So he has enough to cover his operations, but he doesn't have $6,000 to invest. He has been fundraising for about 15 days. He's about 74% through the goal, and currently Foundation for Puerto Rico is doing matching. So we're matching dollar per dollar every loan that you guys make. So what does it mean for the Greater Puerto Rico? I love saying Greater Puerto Rico versus diaspora, and so I think that for me, when I lived in New York City, I wanted to do something for Puerto Rico, but I had to know where my money was going. I couldn't just give it away because we know what happens, right? And there's a lot of lack of trust. So through Kiva, you know exactly where your money is because the borrower tells you how well he or she is doing. They're telling you how many more jobs they have created. And as a lender, when you get that money back, you can recycle it and you can lend it to someone else, which means that your $25, when you lend it to someone else, that's an impact of $50. And you can see that in your profile, the impact that you've done in 2 or more lives. So I encourage you to Google search Kiva Zip and 81%.
Go Fello.
Awesome. So we're 81% through it. So that just give us that final push. So you can Google search Kiva Zip and search Sodas Vivas del Otoao and just lend. You can lend up to like even $5. I think that Kiva in Puerto Rico is basically trying to help micro entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs that do not have access to traditional financing, have that initial step, and it's like a stepping stone. We want Kiva to end up being too small for them. We want them to need a larger loan. We want them to then go through the access to capital ecosystem and go up those ladders so that they can get loans from traditional financing, and then even go through the other side of it, which is private equity, venture capital. You know, that would be amazing to see, so that these entrepreneurs can go full circle on their idea.
So one quick second about that. I think that Denise has made a good point about the stages and the importance of us building steps along the way, because what we found in Puerto Rico was that there were many gaps along the way. So there were some initiatives, either debt or equity, that would help certain segments of the entrepreneurial population, but you got to one step and you fell in the next because there was no continuity. So a lot of what we're doing as an ecosystem, and even with people in the financial services, like financial advisors like Mirna Rivera from Consultiva, is really figuring out how to build that ladder and how to provide both debt and equity financing for entrepreneurs at all stages of growth, from $5 to $5 million. So, good point.
Thank you all. Steve, I don't want to leave you hanging, but I do think that a lot of people in the audience have questions, and I'm sure that they'll have a lot of questions for you, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So I really like to get the audience engaged. We do have a microphone. One of our lovely volunteers from the Cordova Enfernos program will pass the mic, so raise your hand over here. Right there.
So if I understand synthesize the various positions, these are innovative ways of raising capital, which is not a new activity. So my question would be, what's your objective analysis of the particular and special attractors for those investors that are unique to Puerto Rico and are not being overwhelmed by the trends in Latin America, because if I read the trends in Latin America, they are developing, catching up, if not surpassing. I mean, I understand, for example, that in Chile, the computer usage is even higher than Puerto Rico. So in that light, you can speculate about what would Cuba do to that whole, mix. What do you see the strong anchor points that are going to bring or motivate that investment to occur?
You want to take that?
I'll start. First of all, I would say it's not only capital, what we're doing, all three of us or all four of us. Capital is just an important component because of the lack of liquidity, right? So if we want to get things moving on the ground, we have to be able to provide the capital, but also the infrastructure. And I think as to your question regarding specific attraction points for Puerto Rico, a lot has been done, and Miguel alluded to it earlier, with incentive laws to attract capital and people to Puerto Rico. And of course, as with everything else, it's controversial because it's like you're attracting these people and giving them benefits or subsidies or tax breaks, as was done in the past with the 936. But I think that the key to that is to be able to leverage those people that you're bringing in. So it's not like, okay, so you're coming here and bringing your money, and I'm not going to do anything to link you to the local community. And so I'll speak to Guayacans and what we're doing with these people. One of the things that we said is, so if we're having people and companies coming to Puerto Rico, let's figure out a way to link them to local entrepreneurs, because these are people that want to be engaged. They've made the decision to come down there, and most of it is for the tax break. It's not a silver bullet, as we were saying before, but there are important benefits for individuals and companies. And for example, in the panel of investors that I mentioned that we held on Saturday, I had 6 people from that were in Puerto Rico because of Law 22 and also Law 20, which is a law that benefits even local entrepreneurs because it's the export services law. So if we are able to not think of these laws as a silver bullet or even as a standalone, and we're able to construct the adequate structures to attract the capital, then I think we'll be doing something. And you mentioned Chile. And to Miguel's point on benchmarking and the Chile Global and all of that, Chile, one of the things that they did was Startup Chile, where they attracted startup companies to Chile by providing them a visa. And so Puerto Rico will soon announce something similar to that. It's not exactly the same structure, but I think that it goes to Denise's point of inserting Puerto Rico in the global economy. We've been isolated for too long, and if we become more globalized as a community and as a society, then the rest of the things will flow. That's my take.
I agree, and I would add that in terms of assets and offerings, you can't deny that our workforce, and it's not because of you personally, but our statistics can't deny that the education of our workforce, the experience that it has in fields like STEM, where we have the public university being one of the top 10 engineering schools and graduating top-notch talent. We also have infrastructure. That legacy from the 936 has left ports, industrial parks that in perhaps not Chile, but in other economies, they're not existent, and they would cost much more to enter the market and build them. Pair that with the tax incentives, which are very, very attractive, and the fact that we are a U.S. jurisdiction when it comes to legal protections and intellectual property and your right to tort. It's really risky for an investor to think that they can do it in Nicaragua when they can do it in Puerto Rico for the better talent, better protections, and the infrastructure. And there's so the crisis has not eliminated our assets, and I think it's repositioning them for the global market and the global economy, where we really have that silver bullet, and the fact that we don't need government to do that. That's the rifle for that silver bullet.
Right. I want to move it on to another question. The gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. Gracias. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank Federico, Bob, and the panelists for doing this. Hopefully this is the first of many to come. It's very encouraging to have you here and appreciate it. My question is for Denise, but really to all the panelists. But I recently had the privilege of touring El Colaboratorio in Ciudadela in Santurce and had a chance to have a tour by Denise and Baby Jaun Arena. And it was just very encouraging to see. It's beyond a shared office space. I saw and learned about synergies there that again are very encouraging. So I know you had a lot of ground to cover. So would you talk to us a little bit about the concept of El Colaboratorio, if you would?
Sure, thank you, Flavio. So I think in essence, we're trying to find new ways to solve old problems. And as Miguel mentioned earlier, we cannot keep managing the problems. We need to solve them. And one of the things that we saw is that there is a lot of value to collaboration. There is a lot of value, as I mentioned before, to sharing ideas and finding synergies, and then seeing what each person brings to the table, and then what roles each stakeholder can play in putting forth a vision and a plan of action, right? And we decided to create a laboratory of collaborations, hence the name Colaboratorio. And it is a co-working space, about 8,000 square feet in Santurce. We love Santurce, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that later. But in essence, we love how Santurce is vibrant. It used to be much more vibrant, and now there's an uptick, a very interesting uptick, and we want it to be in that hub. So I think mainly we share, we share space, but it's much more than just sharing space with 8 incredible organizations, among them Comprometidos. And we just launched a project called Proyecto País. It's a project for social innovation acceleration, Proyecto Acelerador de Innovación Social. And so what we're trying to do is, how can we accelerate collaborations among organizations, and how can there be kind of like a single back office taking care of all that administrative stuff, so that these organizations that really struggle during those first years when they start can just focus on those missions. Because the beautiful thing about all these organizations is that we are biased towards action. We just want to, get going. Puerto Rico does not have the luxury of just doing more studies and and thinking about problems and managing them. We just have to experiment. And we love design thinking exactly because of that. And idea engineering. We love how we can experiment, and we can, I love the saying, se hace camino al andar, and we learn by doing. And so basically that's what we're trying to do. How can we help these organizations just focus on doing and experimenting?
I want to turn it over to another question. All right.
I graduated from American University in 1984. Kogod College, so 31 years. I'm a financial advisor in Tyson's Corner, and the tax incentives have really got my attention. My wife and I, we go to Puerto Rico every year. We bring a lot of people with us, and we send a lot of people to Puerto Rico. We really like it. My question is, how would I learn more about bringing my business to Puerto Rico and establishing a business there, and how it would all work out?
No worries. So I just wanted to add something really important to.
This question, no?
I'm going to answer your question, to add to what Denise was saying about the importance for El Colaboratorio. Like I said earlier, the Puerto Rico civil society has been very charity based, and when I and our four co-founders and our team started Comprometidos, and when the guys at Abre Puerto Rico, which are promoting government transparency, are getting started, we have to compete with these organizations that have been established and are giving very important critical services like food and shelter to the needy, but are not transformative. And organizations and entities that like El Colaboratorio allow us to catalyze and compete for resources that are very scarce but are transformative. And I think so. That's what I wanted to add from the client side of El Colaboratorio. When it comes to your question, what we're doing through Puerto Rico Global is educating about these incentives, and we've created a series of partnerships with the Department of Economic Development and Commerce and Puerto, which is the agency that certifies the decrees, the tax incentives decrees, and a network called Puerto Rico is the Answer, which is a network of professional and industry leaders in Puerto Rico who are willing to come to you and tell you in your industry what their experiences are, whether they find talent, where the opportunities are, and how you can benefit from them. So if you give me your card after, we can definitely talk. And you can talk to Bianca also, who has been an ambassador, and we've been through as a pilot engagement with her, putting her in touch with the government of Puerto Rico and with some peers, and to leverage these tax incentives for the economic development of the island and for your own benefit.
And there's a website called Doing Business in Puerto Rico that talks about Law 20 and 22, and I used to work in the government before my current job, and I'll be happy to connect you with folks on the island as well that can shepherd you through the process. But I believe Laura.
Exactly what I was going to say. You can download fact sheets on that website, and we'd be happy to connect you to the people that will give you an orientation, but also, as Miguel was saying, connect you to specific service providers that, as I was saying to the gentleman, it's not about leveraging the laws individually, but about really getting to know your business and building the package that is right for you. So you might find that more than one law will apply when you go down there. So businessinpuertorico.com.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is very interesting. This question is probably directed at Steve, but I'll have anybody's opinions on this. But I want to build on something that Laura said about globalization. If you go back to Panama in the early to mid 1990s, the Southern Command had to get out of Panama. Puerto Rico was competing for this. Everybody in the government, both on the island and here, agreed that the best place for the Southern Command was going to be Puerto Rico. It is my personal opinion that Florida got it because they have 2 senators. This is not about politics, so chill. But it gave me an early indication that Puerto Rico really plays with one arm behind their back. So that also gave me the initial thought of, this is really about the people in Puerto Rico have to get themselves out of this hole. This was way before the recession. So I'm very interested in the topic. But globalization is happening, and look at what's happening in Cuba. How can Puerto Rico compete against Florida for the investment that is going to be directed towards Cuba, not Puerto Rico? How do we build upon what's happening in Puerto Rico in terms of resources, capability, know-how, and compete to rebuild Cuba once it opens up? And mind you, the vast majority of Americans believe it's time to do that, regardless of what the people in Florida say. And it's a very small group. So my point really is, what are your thoughts around this? I don't intend to be a Debbie Downer. I'm just trying to point to the obvious threat for the island's future, and how can we take advantage of that opportunity, which is, at the end of the day, what innovation is about, how to take advantage of an opportunity. But this is also a threat. Anyway, that's my
I want to segue for Steve to answer the question. And one of the reasons I forgot in the intro to mention why I brought Steve. Steve mentioned the Alliance for Progress that Kennedy created. And one of the first, if not the first administrators of the Alliance for Progress was Teodoro Moscoso, who was the key architect of Operación Manos a la Obra, Operation Bootstrap. Puerto Rico had an active presence in the State Department under Undersecretary Arturo Morales Carrión. Teodoro Moscoso later went and became the ambassador in Venezuela, the U.S. ambassador in Venezuela. So Puerto Rico, under a lot of its socioeconomic programs, undertook trainings for USAID programs to bring in people from Latin America and train them on how to implement several programs. So Steve, if you could answer his question, and also segue on what Puerto Rico can learn from trends in Latin America.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about the Southern Command that it has now been transformed into the city of knowledge. And it's been a virtual taking the swords and turning them into plowshares. It's the civil society ground zero now. Universities, schools, NGOs, all the multilaterals are there. It's one of the most exciting places I've ever seen, okay? So it's a reminder of what can happen when you decide to really transform something for this next century. The second part of that is I can go back 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago where people were always worrying about what happens to the Dominican Republic, what happens to Cuba, or to Jamaica and the DR when Cuba finally opens up. And I think my first reaction is there's no one that thinks there's going to be a big boom about Cuba. It's going to be very sticky. It's going to be very complicated. It's going to take a lot of time, which I think in view of what you're trying to do, pick up the pace. I think you've got all the right elements in place. And we've been talking about the ecosystem. This is, go to Korea and really understand how they built that ecosystem that has created so much wealth. Go to Finland and understand the story of how after World War II, what was really a third world country, created Nokia in this incredible position in the market. It was through what Miguel was talking about, and all of them, the public-private partnership. If you get all three of those pistons working together, you've got it. The other thing, keep an eye on all of the businesses that are leaving China and coming back to the U.S. because of the, quote, hidden cost. It's a long, long ways away. There are just all kinds of legal and other hidden costs that have been going up. And when you really look at Puerto Rico with a fresh set of eyes, its position, its proximity, its bilingualism, the depth of its universities and its educated, the intellectual capital of the place, and the fact that you are magnetizing this ecosystem to bring this kind of talent back. You've got all the elements in place, I think, to rebrand, reposition Puerto Rico as a dynamic force in the Caribbean. Of this, I'm really convinced.
So we have time for one more question because we do have a reception that I'm sure everybody wants to enjoy. Laura here has, oh, there's one more. All right, well, let's do two, just two. All right. So, oh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
There's already one there, but go.
Okay, I'm a historian. Okay, I'm a historian, so I'm interested in how all of these new social enterprises that you're talking about engage with history, that is, kind of keep historical traditions alive, keep historical architecture, historical agriculture. You know, when I was on the island last summer, one of the most exciting things was seeing all these new coffee shops that were, you know, sort of reviving, thanks to you, reviving all of these great hacienda traditions, not the bad parts of haciendas, but the good parts of haciendas. And I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about that. How do you keep that history alive and reinvent it for the future?
Federico, if I may, I'm happy to take that question. We are going to capitalize on all our history, on our farms, on our culture, with the visitor economy. And we want to capture visitors that want to have an authentic experience in Puerto Rico. We want visitors to visit our farms and to learn and to eat what is being farmed there. And we already have a project that we're supporting at the foundation called Rico. And I invite you to search in the internet. And they are just launching all these visits to farms. And we're also going to capitalize on our historic tourism. There are many people that love to visit other parts of the world to enjoy the history, to enjoy the culture, to experience the culture. And in Puerto Rico, we have a huge creative economy. It's just that we've never positioned it to be inserted into the global economy. And that's what Foundation for Puerto Rico thinks that we are due to leverage and maximize. So how can Puerto Rico be, if we think about the 1.2 billion visitors that go around the world to have authentic experiences, only 3.5 million of those choose Puerto Rico. That's 0.3%. So we have a lot of opportunity to capture. Even a percentage of that would be huge for Puerto Rico. And so the question is how, right? And I think that if we start by seeing how we can leverage our history and our culture, beyond just protecting it, let's see how we can help others experience it authentically and create value and a spillover effect for many more people. What I love about the visitor economy is that it is a platform in which anyone can be inserted, whether it's being an employee or an entrepreneur. And there's a lot of spillover effects from having visitors visit Puerto Rico for a variety of reasons. And mainly because if you want to have an authentic experience, you're going to go beyond the metro area. You're going to go beyond just the hotels. And that's where people can insert themselves and create value and prosperity for it doesn't matter what your skill sets are. You can be inserted in the visitor economy.
One of the things to add to that is that it's so exciting that the diversification that you want to bring to tourism. People think about the beaches in Puerto Rico and ecotourism and all of that, but it's only 6% of the economy, so there's a lot of room to grow with medical tourism and obviously Campus Puerto Rico and the farm, so it's really exciting. Do we want to go to the last question, or do you guys have anything to add to that? No? All right.
Well, thank you so much, first of all. It's been an amazing panel, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Bianca Caban. Miguel so nicely introduced me. I really appreciate the shout out. My question is around social innovation, specifically around women. I heard President Kagame, the president of Rwanda, last week speak about how he's actually used the equal participation of both genders in his country to revitalize the country in a way that's been really tremendous for their economic development. Rwanda has 70% of women in its parliament, so it's basically the highest percentage of women in parliament in any country in the world. How can Puerto Rico, a small country, that's pretty much probably the only thing in common with Rwanda, how can Puerto Rico really leverage women to change the face of the country, or and also I've been spending the day with two fantastic female leaders, Lucienne and Marta Michelle. A lot more to come from them, but they told me a very difficult statistic that in Puerto Rico, 60% of women are below poverty line, and as we all know, women are oftentimes primary breadwinners, heads of household, and make the financial decisions. So I think that I'm just curious to hear how we can incorporate women more in Puerto Rico in terms of economic revitalization.
You first or me first? I love your question. Laura and I actually are very active in that, and with Lucien also as well, in that matter in Puerto Rico. And I would say that it's been actually sort of like a year that this has been picking up. And I think our inspiration has come from a series of books. Powering Up by Ann Doyle, Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, and we started having the discussion. So a group of women from different sectors, from different age groups, have come together to say we need to start talking to each other. We need to start getting together, connecting each other, inspiring each other, pushing each other to lead more, and we also have to start mentoring the women that are growing up, and we need to inspire them to choose STEM careers, to always lead by example. And so just last Wednesday we had an amazing event named Are We There Yet? And in this event we invited a representative of UN Women, for he, for she, and the only male in a room full of 250 women. So you can imagine how that must have felt. And so we also invited Janet Salazar, who is taking on different events throughout the nation about leadership and women leadership. So it's incredible how, I love your question because this is something that is just starting out in Puerto Rico, but it's going to be a movement. And I actually there was actually an article after that event that came out on Friday. And I made the mistake of looking at comments at Endy. I shouldn't have done that. And those comments were just horrendous. But they validated that we have to do this. They validated that this is a discussion that we need to continue because there is so much ignorance out there. And so I'm excited about the prospects of it. I think that there should be more women in CEO suites, in C-suites. There should be more women in boards, and there should be much more women in government.
So just to add on to that, shout out to Lucien, who for a couple of years sponsored a women-led business prize at our enterprise competition before she became an entrepreneur. But I think what is important with what Denise is saying is that it's a movement organized by women who have had different experiences in the corporate sector as entrepreneurs. But that it's important to engage men in the conversation, because if we don't do that, then we're being, not inclusive with them, and that's what we're complaining about, right? So we talked about this at this event on Wednesday. We talked about a further workshop in October that's going to be conversations with men, and that's bound to be interesting because each of us has to bring a man with us to the workshop. So God knows what will happen, but I think that we see it in our programs all the time. In the winners of our competition, they are predominantly women, and it's wonderful to see women in untraditional fields, like even being an entrepreneur and science and technology, as Denise was saying. So I think that we have to be mentors for them and provide the example, but also be inclusive with the guys that are willing to support us.
Which are many, by the way. I've had so many men be sponsors, champions, and mentors, and I think many of us feel that way.
I know there's so many more questions, but we do have a reception that we want to go to, and people want to mingle, and feel free to come up to the panelists and ask any questions you want. So I want to close it there and thank Bob again and American University and all of our distinguished panelists and all of you for coming.
Gracias a ti. Ya sabes, tienes presión de hacer un segundo. De verdad me preguntaron dos personas como que si esto era the first of a series. Hello, how are you? I just want to say it on the microphone so I get rid of this chair.
Hola. Mucho gusto. Hola. Mucho gusto. Gracias por venir. Espero que se puedan quedar y darse un traguito o algo. Qué bueno. Sí. Qué bueno. ¿Qué están estudiando? ¿Sí? ¿Y concentración en qué? Sí. Pues considera hacer un minor o una concentración en empresarismo social. Yo creo que esa es la vía del futuro, no porque yo lo haya hecho. Por ahí tienes el director del programa que te puede ayudar. Miguel, todo bueno. Déjame.
Hello, Arthur.
Gracias.
Probably. What is her name? Yes, she was a roommate of one of my friends. Oh, wow. Ay, de verdad. Fantástica, estaba con los ahora hablamos. la novia, está muy bien. Yo también tengo novia. ¿Qué pasó? Joven, joven, bella, qué buen gusto. Pero que el pueblo pero gracias por venir. Por eso hay que contarlo, como mucha gente no lo sabe. Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for being us. Nos vemos. Ojalá nos veamos pronto por allá. Y Ana, you'll be back. Hay tiempo, hay tiempo, hay tiempo.
Are you with the foundation?
No. No, Denise is the other panelist, but I can help you. I used to work there.
Yeah, because I'm good friends.
Oh, you are? What's your name? Hi, Steve. Pleasure to meet you. I lead another organization. I used to work for John, and it's actually his fault that I have my current job.
So I started
Oh, wow, of course. Yes, very familiar. I was a customer a long time ago.
Right, I know.
And do you go back frequently? You have to go see the collaboratorio. It's wonderful. I will. It's a pleasure to meet you. Hello. ¿Qué haces aquí? Voy a ir para allá porque esto está detrás de la mesa como una cosa extraña. Pero qué chévere.
está un poquito beat up porque no lo pensaba traer. Es el Puerto Rico Investment Summit de Latinoamérica. Aquí está el código para gente que está los primos. Aquí tengo la hoja de registro. Pero está el Freeway, que es el Hola. Hola, Melissa. Nicole, aquí me embarazo, Nicole.
Well done.
Don't tell me that. You guys did everything.
So you have good pictures?
Yeah, I have really good pictures. I tweeted some really good pictures.
Yeah, and I have some. So if you want to send me some, I can send you
sure.
some that I took. I didn't take many.
I took a lot of the group. I mean, it's a phone.
Oh yeah, well I know, me too. That's all.
But pretty good turnout. I mean, I have the list.
Oh yeah.
And it was over 100 people.